It's really a great pleasure to take part at this distinguished event. And usually it is the most easiest session, the last one, or it is the most difficult. It's just from the point of view you are looking at. And we were looking at different balancing that we have to do in public-private partnership, in professionalization, which will be speak tomorrow. And today we are really grateful that with us is Mr. Pedro Telles, who is coming from Swansea University. And on the other side with us is Mr. Nikita Stampa, coming from the European Commission. And we are going to discuss about something that is connected with some previous topics, like innovation, and also with other topics that were discussed today. So everything is interrelated, everything should be covered multidisciplinary, and I'm sure that all of us will enjoy in those presentations.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and welcome to the final session, also known as the graveyard session, or today the Mexico versus Brazil session. So while I'm speaking, if the result changes, please inform me. Please inform me and tell me who has scored in the meanwhile. Now, I know that this is a difficult session to do because everyone is already looking forward to what's going to happen afterwards. So myself and Nikita, what we're going to try to do is to keep you awake for the next hour or hour and a half. So we'll do our best to do that. I'm going to be talking about some thoughts and challenges of electronic procurement from a perspective. And I've got my presentation divided into two parts. The first one being what are we doing, and the second one, what we should be doing. And then inside each half, there's going to be a subdivision, and you'll see some extra elements that I'm going to be talking about. So what are we doing in terms of electronic procurement at EU level? As François Licher said very well this morning, most of the regulatory emphasis in public procurement has been essentially on the procedural side of things. So when you look at the rules in the directives, what you're going to find is that most of them apply to the procedure, so how the contract is going to be awarded, not what happens before, not what happens afterwards. It's no surprise then that when it comes down to electronic procurement, we face the same problem, or we face the same issue. What we have today is essentially, or we're going to have today, is essentially taking the same mental models and mental frameworks that we've been using for the last 100 years or so, which are very procedurally based and focused, and moving them to an online world. So, for the most part, we're leaving those processes unchanged. We're just changing the way that we deliver and run them. And that is the first message I'd like to give you, the first thought of challenge is, why are you doing it this way? Why didn't you take the opportunity to change practice? And just for the most part, we're just copying the practice that we had before and doing it online instead of doing it in paper. In terms of what's actually happening in the ground, this is a timeline prepared by the Commission. Yeah, you've seen this. Some of you have seen this before, yeah. I said you guys could have gone out for a coffee and enjoy the sun. So this is the dates of introductions of entry into force of different elements of electronic procurement in the EU since 2014 and all the way to 2019. You'll see that today, in July 2018, not everything is yet in force, and that is, again, one question that I'd like to raise, is that although the transposition date for the directives were, in general, the 2014 directives was 2 years, so we're talking about April 2016, for communications and most of electronic procurement related provisions, there has been or a few more months or even years for the transpositions to happen. You'll see as well that this is a slides, or this is a PDF from the Commission. It's not mine, and it includes, I think very well, it includes a mention to e-invoicing as part of electronic procurement. Now, e-invoicing was not covered directly on the procurement directives of 2014, but it was covered on its own directive because it's much wider and broader than just public procurement, because it covers the whole of the economic activity in the EU and not just public procurement. But it makes sense to actually look at it also from a procurement angle, and we're going to mention it further down in the presentation. So, driving into a little bit of the details of what we're doing right now, I would like to focus on 3 points only. First, the Commission Strategy for Public Procurement from 2017. That is a communication that was published by the Commission in October 2017. Then the ESPD, which stands for European Single Procurement Document, which is one of the key pillars of electronic procurement and the changes introduced in electronic procurement by the 2014 directives. And then finally, E-Certis, which is one of the other pillars of that change as well, and those changes. So what about the communication, the Commission communication from 2017? Now, it had 6 strategic priorities, and the idea behind it, as far as I know, is to create a work plan for the Commission regarding public procurement for the next, 18 months or 24 months. That is basically the life cycle of the current Commission until the term ends and until we get a new Commission sometime in 2019. You'll see that if you look at this document, most of it is tackling or targeting what I would call the plumbing and the infrastructure. So it doesn't imply, or it seems not to imply, the need for any change in legal framework, but more of a tidying up of the understructure of electronic procurement and also other areas of procurement, so that when the time comes, perhaps in the future, we're going to be in a better position to introduce further legal changes that may be required. On the side of electronic procurement, out of those 6 provisions or 6 key initiatives, we had 2 targeting or relevant for electronic procurement. The first one was increasing transparency, integrity, and better data, and the second one, boosting the digital transformation of procurement. As for the first one, there's not much in terms of detail around it. There's a lot of, in terms of ideas that the Commission would like to achieve, but there's one idea there that I'd like to mention, and that is of mandatory contract registers. It's puzzling to a certain extent that we are in 2017 or 2018, and we're looking at contract registers as a new idea or something that the Commission wants the member states to have. It should have been done ages ago. It's a shame that it has not been done. And that is the first problem. The second one is that it's going to be done in a way that is very old school, and it's very much based on what I would call a publication system. So what this is going to imply is that there's going to be an obligation for the contracting authority to publish the contract information, the actual contract, in whatever portal or platform that may be appropriate for that objective. Fundamentally, this is no different from a current obligation that already exists and has existed for many years, which is the obligation to publish on Tenders Electronic Data, or Tenders Electronic Daily, the contract information. That obligation already exists. You'll be surprised, however, to know that compliance with that obligation is much lower than the compliance, the equivalent obligation of publishing the contract information notice at the beginning of the procedure. And the reason for that is, it's very simple to explain. It adds no value whatsoever to the contracting authority. It's just a manual job that someone has to do at the end of the process, and there's basically no consequences. So on the side of the incentives, there's no incentive for anyone to comply with it. On the side of the consequences, there's no stick to force compliance. None whatsoever. So what happens? People don't do it because their jobs don't depend on it. Furthermore, and that is for me a much critical issue to point out, is that we're not going to have, as far as I can tell from that document, any system for automatic data capture. So it still implies, as I said, that it's going to be a manual job of someone, somewhere, somehow, inputting that data manually on those contract registers. And the experience tells us that even in systems where there is enforcement, like Portugal, the manual work, the added manual work is done on a rush. It's done, as we would say, on the top of your knees. And it's not surprising that sometimes, and very often, you're going to find problems with the data because the data is unreliable, even though it's technically there. Now, as for the other one, the digital transformation, there's one sentence in the document that reads something along the lines that we need to undergo a digital transformation of procurement. And I agree with that idea, that I think that's a great idea. The question is how? With what purpose? And how are we going to do that without touching the legal framework? I think it's pretty much impossible. I think it's a good statement of intent. It means that the Commission is effectively recognizing that for electronic procurement to work, it actually cannot be restrained by our previous practice, the practice that was made sense on an offline world. It needs to be different. But so far, we don't have any specific information of how this is going to be achieved. As for the proposals themselves, they're also very, very light. And more often than not, what they are is rehashing of existing proposals. We're talking about like the single digital gateway, or European services card, or what the Commission calls developing existing standards, like the ESPD and the CERTIS. There's nothing here that the Commission was not already doing. There's no real new initiative other than let's polish what we already have. And as I said, if you take this as a work program only for the next 2 years in terms of clearing up the underlying problems with electronic procurement, that may make sense. However, when you take this document together, when you look at it together, it's a little bit confusing because you're looking at what should be a work program, but in reality, it's more of a statement of intent. There's no real milestones, at least when it comes down to electronic procurement, no real milestones in that document that you can refer to and say, okay, this is going to change by this date. These are the new improvements that we're going to introduce by this and that date. And that is a shame because it would have been much preferable, in my view, at the same time to be more coherent and cohesive in the vision of what needs to be changed in terms of electronic procurement. So that's what I wanted to say about the Commission strategy document. Then, what are we doing as well in terms of the SPD? As I said, the SPD is one of the key changes or innovations introduced by the 2014 directives in terms of trying to improve electronic procurement or trying to improve procurement that makes sense in an electronic world or in an online world. I've written a paper about a year ago about it and I identified a bunch of issues with it. And I'd like to talk about most of them, but we don't have the time. So I'm just going to mention 2. The first one is on the framework side, on the framework column. You're going to see there highlighted in red, language barriers. The ESPD makes perfect sense until we start looking at the details and the language barriers that it doesn't address, at least not directly, and at some stage they will have to be addressed if we're really going to have electronic cross-border, if you're going to really have cross-border procurement in Europe. Because, for example, the ESPD presupposes that the economic operator is going to inform the contracting authority where, for example, the information about its qualification or its, the conditions that justify it not being excluded, where they are available. They may be available, for example, on a repository online. Let's say that you're talking about a French company that wants to bid in Portugal. So it would submit the ESPD in Portugal, and the Portuguese authority would go to a French database and then try to figure out where is their goddamn document in French. And then you replace French by any other country and any other language, and you immediately start to see the problems with this approach unless language barriers are tackled. So language, in my view, and not only my view, I'm not the first one saying this, language is the elephant in the room in terms of procurement that we're not willing to talk about or address, and we'll have to if you really want to have direct cross-border procurement. The Commission, hold on, I forgot the other one. I forgot the lowering of compliance standards. The second issue I like to talk about is more of a practical nature, and that is the lowering of compliance standards. As you may be aware, if you're running a standard, an open procedure, you can now run it basically as a single-stage procedure. That you receive the tenders immediately at the beginning, and then you only analyze the data, the qualification data and information from the winner by just requesting the SPD and then just confirming the information in the SPD from the winner and not everyone else. Now, I'm fully in favor of this change, but it does not come without any risks. It adds the risk of lowering compliance standards. And what I mean by lowering compliance standards? By the moment that the contracting authority has identified the winner, it already knows who it wants to perform the contract. So if in that moment it checks the documentation and finds out that there is a minor incompliance or lack of compliance, or it is a minor problem or even a major problem, it may have the incentive of overlooking that issue and simply award the contract nonetheless, or give a little bit extra time for the problem to be resolved that it wouldn't under other circumstances. So there's a risk here that we're going to have a lower compliance in terms of checking the conditions of exclusion and also the conditions for qualification and suitability that we wouldn't have in the old model. As I said, I'm in favor of the new one. I'm not saying that I'm not. I'm just saying that it increases the risk, and we need to be aware of this increase in terms of risk of compliance. Now, moving on to what are we doing in terms of the SPD, In May 2017, the Commission published a review of the SPD, and as far as I know, it's the only one until sometime in 2019 when we'll get the new one. This was done based on with data related to 2016, and the data about the member states wasn't very flattering. Most of them were still using the paper version, so it means that they had, most of them didn't have online systems going at the end of 2016. Let's not forget that many member states had not transposed the directive yet in 2016 either. And also, most of the member states were, the ones that were actually using online systems of any sort, were using the Commission's own online ESPD system, which is supposed to be temporary. Okay, we're talking about late 2016. Maybe the situation will have improved by now. But as far as I know, and Nikita, please correct me if I'm wrong, the idea or the plan is for the Commission to actually switch off this system sometime in 2019. So the member states, in my view, are still delaying, putting these systems in place. And if I had to guess, what's going to happen is come late 2018 or early 19, they're all going to be doing it at a rush, or they're just going to throw their hands in the air and ask the Commission to keep it running for some extra time. But there's something else in that document that I think it's really interesting. The document is not very long, but there's this sentence that I find really, really interesting about it. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on it. And this is basically it. Technical, legal, and procedural issues were raised during the meetings. Now, I happen to know that the SPD rollout has been problematic in many countries, because I talk with people in those countries and they tell me they have difficulties, which are normal when you're setting up a new system. I'm fine with that, I don't have a problem. My problem here is that on a review document like this one, we would be told, or we are told that there are technical, legal, and procedural issues, and we're not told what they are, how important they are, how serious they are, and how they can be solved. So by putting that sentence over there, is like the Commission effectively trying to hide in plain sight that maybe problems with the transposition and implementation of the SPD, but without giving us any of the details so that we can actually analyze what are those problems and how can we solve them. And on a review document, which I stress is the last review document that you're going to have until 2019, I think that we would have benefited from hearing and knowing a lot more about what were those technical, procedural, and legal issues that were raised in those meetings. Now, that document also touched, the review document also touched another leg of the stool, which is the E-certis. And the E-certis is a very interesting system, and actually one that I think makes perfect sense, which is effectively an online repository where you're going to find information about the documents that are required by contracting authorities in a member state, and also the documents that that contractors were or where the documents of a contractor is expected to be found on that member state as well. That I think it's a great tool, and I think it makes perfect sense. The problem, however, is when we start looking again at the details, and being a lawyer, I'm a nitty-picky guy for details. And on the E-certis page, there is this disclaimer, which I think it's a very important disclaimer again to spend a couple of minutes on. Please note that E-certis is a reference tool and not a service of legal advice. It does not guarantee that information resulting from a query will be recognized as valid by a contracting authority. So, imagine that you are a bidder again, let's say, let's not use France again, let's use, you're an Italian bidder and you want to bid in Denmark. And you go to the E-certis system, you think that you know exactly what documents are required, you produce those documents, submit it to the contracting authority when requested, and then the contracting authority says, I'm sorry, you gave me the wrong documents. Oh yeah, but I went to E-certis and this is what is there, I don't care. E-certis is a reference tool, it's not a legal source. And that for me is the critical error at this moment in time and the critical failure with the E-certis. Because even, as I said, in that document from 2017 that reviewed the SPD, the E-certis was also reviewed. And the Commission recognized that E-certis imposes positive obligations on member states to keep it updated. But again, it comes down to the incentives and the consequences. There are no consequences for the member states if they don't put it, if they don't keep it up to date. Now, you can say, well, from a general EU law perspective, there are, and I know that there are, but in terms of a day-to-day basis and the day-to-day consequences, there aren't. So if the E-certis instead had the nature of being a canonical version of what are the requirements of that member state, that any and every economic operator for any member state could rely on that as being the canon, the canonical requirement, then the member states will have the incentive and the consequences of keeping up to date. Because then it's a problem of the national law not complying with the EU law, and then it's the national law, obviously that would be, that would fail in terms of how the system of supremacy of EU law works. And if it's only a reference tool, why monitoring the compliance? Because we are in the worst of both worlds, which is we have something that could be really good, but it's not reliable enough, and we're not making it reliable enough so that is really useful for people in practice. So I hope that in the future, e-certis is revised and it stops to be seen as a reference tool and something with a more established legal nature. Now we have, how's the game? 0-0, okay. So we've got 10 minutes. Let's move on to the second half of my presentation. It should be 10 minutes. It should be 10 minutes. So what should we be doing instead? And again, I'm going to divide this part into three topics or three main ideas. The first one is technological islands. The second, data standards and APIs. And the third, a modern electronic procurement system. Those of you that were my students a couple of weeks ago in Belgrade have seen this slide, they've seen this picture before. And this is the archipelago of the Canary Islands, which, although I'm Portuguese, I will recommend you to visit because they're very beautiful. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is not because they're really in a nice place to go, but because they have a story to tell in terms of evolution. They all belong to the same archipelago, the Macaronesia, and if you look at the islands on your right, which are the older islands, they are low-lying islands. They've been eroded over many, many years due to the wind and also the water, and the kind of fauna and flora they support is very much different from the younger islands. And even on the younger islands, you see a lot of differences because some of those ecosystems have been evolving separately. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because when you look at electronic procurement and at how it has been set up in the directive, we're effectively fostering a number of technological islands. We're effectively saying to the member states, invest in developing your own systems without taking into account that they're supposed to work together or they should be working together in a way or another. So what you're going to end up is a situation whereby the member states make those investments, some of them begrudgingly. They'll make those investments, and we're making those investments based on mental models and mental frameworks that are quite old. And when the time comes and we understand that doesn't make any sense, all of them will have their own system, and all of them will fight tooth and nail not to change it, and they will not accept the need to change because they've invested so much in those systems that they don't want to move it. They don't want anything else. So this is problematic because we had a great opportunity with this transition to electronic procurement in the mid-2010s, so when technology was reasonably stable, certainly more stable than 10 years before, where you could have standardized the systems, where you could have imposed at the very least shared APIs and eventually shared standards as well, and at least today we haven't really done it. And that is the next point of my presentation, which is how would we go about and do it? I think that we should have adopted the Open Contracting Data Standard. Some of you might have heard about it, some of you might not. It is basically a way to capture all the information connected with public procurement, and the systems can have whatever features you want, but the standard implies certain requirements so that you are compliant with the standard. It's quickly becoming the world baseline in terms of data standards, and it's being used in multiple countries, including inside the EU or very close to the EU. So, if I'm not wrong, the Open Contracting Data Standard is being used by Ukraine, who has an association agreement with the EU, which covers procurement and has specific obligations in procurement. And is also being used, or at least it's going to be used supposedly, in the UK. We'll see how that happens or not. It also has very strong governance system behind it, so it's a very international governance structure. And it's available on a fairly free and open source license. So there was no reason for us not to look into it and actually adopt it. And actually, there is a reason not to do it, which is obviously it wasn't invented here, so we didn't invent it, so there's no point in us adopting it. I think that is a short-sighted view of the standard, because if the EU, and I'm talking this at the EU level more than the member state level, if the EU were to join the Open Contracting Data Standard Governance Board, it could influence the standard going forward, and could influence as well, have more leverage in terms of getting something that is important for negotiations, for example, in the context of the GPA, which is how are other countries dealing with procurement, and could effectively use that as a leverage to extract information from other countries when it comes down to negotiate procurement agreements with them. Unfortunately, we're not doing it. Now, let's say that the Open Contracting Data Standard was not feasible for whatever reason. What could have we done instead? Well, we could have copied it, so we could have forked it and used it, or we could have then reinvented the wheel, which I wouldn't recommend, but we could have reinvented the wheel and do, in terms of data standards for electronic procurement, the same thing that was done for e-invoicing. So remember I mentioned invoicing at the beginning, and it's interesting that the invoicing directive is pretty much contemporaneous with the procurement ones. There's maybe, I think, 6 months difference between both of them, between both sets. But the invoicing directive actually sets up the European standard, which every single member state will have to comply with, even if they already have their own. They'll have to adopt that European single standard. So it's going to be mandatory, and it's going to be mandatory not only for procurement but also for the whole country, so for the whole of the EU, also for private transactions. So it's a shame that back in 2014, when we could have considered the same thing for electronic procurement, we didn't. And my fear is that the window of opportunity to do so has closed or is closing very fast because the member states are committing resources to systems that are incompatible and based on different standards. Now, to finish it off, I'm going to be talking about a case study. Sometimes it's important for us to get out of our comfort zone. And 2 years ago, I got an invitation to go down to this beautiful city, Buenos Aires, and work on, and give a workshop on public procurement, including a little bit about electronic procurement, because the government there recognized that they needed some help with public procurement. I would say they probably need some help as well with the national team, but being Portuguese, maybe I shouldn't make those jokes. I went down there with that typical European arrogance and attitude that we knew everything about procurement because we Europeans have the most advanced system in the world. We're so much better than everyone else. What do we have to learn from anyone else in the world because we're so good? And I came back humbled. Not because of Argentina, because Argentina actually needs some help, but because its smaller neighbor, Paraguay, which is, stands between Argentina and Brazil. Now, Paraguay makes for a very interesting case study in what comes down to electronic procurement. So it's a fairly small economy. It would probably be one of the poorest EU member states if it was a EU member state. It created a traditional electronic procurement system back in 2004 for the usual reasons, curb corruption. And then in 2012, which is more or less the same time that our directives were being drafted, it joined the Open Government Partnership, which is behind the Open Contracting Data Standard. Fast forward 2 years, there was an election, and the party that won the election came to power with a brief to promote transparency and to promote accountability in various areas, including public procurement. So what did they do was they threw out the old system and developed a completely new one. And this is more or less how it looks. In the middle, you've got the National Procurement Central Database. On top, you've got the procurement portal and platform, which have to be used. And below it, you've got the Finance Ministry IT system. And they all communicate, they're all individual systems, and they all communicate via APIs. Very simple. They don't have to do everything. It's not a monolithic system that you have one single system doing everything. You just have multiple systems that communicate in what they need to communicate. And the way it works is simply brilliant. Let's say that you are a contracting authority. You want to tender a contract. You do it on a platform. Then you put the contract Actually, the contract is already in the platform, is already in the portal, so it's captured automatically. And then when the contract is performed, the contractor wants to raise an invoice and wants an invoice to be paid. So the invoice needs to be raised in the platform. That invoice generates a payment code or payment number that goes down to the finance ministry to be checked, and then the finance ministry processes the payment. So all this is done integrated in a vertical way. And if it only did this, that would be perfect. But because it's a transactional system and not a publications one, what it does, it actually captures every single procurement transaction in Paraguay, even the modifications. So let's say that you want to modify that contract. Fine, you modified it on the platform, you generate a new payment code, a new invoice, a new payment code, and you make that payment. And that data, all that data is captured immediately, and it's available for anyone to see. So this is the only system I know that I can guarantee you captures 100% of spend, procurement spend in the whole country. But hey, in Europe, we're so great, we're awesome, we do things so well in procurement, we have nothing to learn from anyone else. And it's a shame, because this is a system that works really well, was done and developed on a very tight budget, and is done in a way that I find it very positive, which is it is iterating, so they keep on developing it. So it's not like certain countries that developed a good system 10 years ago and then they leave it there for the next 10 years without touching. No, they keep evolving the system. To the point that, for example, if you have a complaint to raise, the complaints actually are processed or are lodged and registered in the system as well, and they can be, as far as I know, they can be public. You can export the data on any format you like or want. You can visualize the data in any format or way you want. So it is what a procurement system in 2018 should look. That we're not doing it for the most part, as far as I know, inside the European Union, the mind boggles me. So, to conclude, I call this presentation thoughts and also challenges. So here are my thoughts. The current EU electronic procurement approach revolves around old mental frameworks. The same ones that we have been using for the better part of 100 years, more or less they've been transposed for the online world. ESPD and E-certis, especially the first, they are bandages on deeper wounds and they are a sign of deeper problems. Part of the problems with ESPD and E-certis is that they are not self-contained systems within procurement, they actually need to interface with systems in the wider administration, and that's what makes them so difficult to work well. And then, as I said, I think the member states are going to be stuck in what I call technological islands for the foreseeable future, because they'll have invested in systems which, for the most part, work with their own standards and with their own ways of thinking, and will not help especially SMEs winning any contracts cross-border. Why? Because if you think about electronic procurement and how it should level the playing field, that only works if everyone is more or less using the same technologies and if everyone is more or less using the same tools. If you look at these electronic platforms and if you look at these systems as operating systems, if you have 27 different operating systems, the companies and the undertakings from the home member state are always going to be at an advantage, because that is the one they work on a day-to-day basis, where someone else is coming from outside, does not have experience working with that. You may say to me, Pedro, but large companies, they have enough money to spend on actually training people and getting people to get used to that, to those other systems from those countries. And I say, yes, that's true, the large companies, but not the SMEs. So if you really want to solve the problem of improving direct cross-border procurement for SMEs, you need to look into the landscape of the electronic platforms and the electronic systems they're putting in place on each member state. Because if you make them too different, in addition to the issues I've mentioned like language, if you make them too different, you're not going to help the SMEs at all. So the SME share of the procurement spend will remain for the most part unchanged, at least in terms of direct cross-border procurement. And then the final, in terms of challenges, you probably gotten there by now, is I think we bet on the wrong horse. I think we bet on a publication system in terms of electronic procurement in Europe, and we should have made the bet instead on a transactional system, which is what Paraguay has. It is also what Ukraine has. So the challenge for me is, How do we move from the current system, which is a publications one, into a transactional one in the near future? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I was in a big dilemma because I know your wish to inform you, but because you were in Paraguay and Neymar did something, I didn't know how it will influence on your presentation, so I decided not to tell you that. Of course, I always support critical approach because the only way how we are going to move further and to develop is to be as critical as possible. And having in mind that today lawyers were on the table, you know, formalities and so important things, legal certainty, as you mentioned, is also extremely important, as other aspects. So again, multidisciplinary approach is very, very important. So I think this session will be one of the most interesting because I already see that there will be different opinion all over the hall. So please, Mr. Stampa, join us.
Before going down in the arena, let me first thank a lot Gustavo and the university. I mean, it's really an honor for me to be in such a prestigious university, in this place in Rome, in such an amazing place. A big thank. I didn't have the opportunity to come last year, and I regret it very much, and I'm happy to be here this time. I also want to thank Pedro, because of course this is very useful to be challenged. And I also think that you put the finger on a number of very correct things. But I may also challenge you because I think that probably the description of what we are doing, the description you have done of what we're doing does not reflect 100% the reality. And there may also be some factual things that I will address. But indeed, several things of my presentation are in mirror to what Pedro has been highlighting. Let me take you to briefly the different point I wish to look at. What's the objective of e-procurement? Why do we do that all together? What's the state of play in the EU? What is the infrastructure? Openness and partnership, which is a policy approach which can complement a legal approach, doesn't substitute certainly. I'll have a word about data policy, because data is very much and directly connected to e-procurement and becoming it more and more. And a reference to digital transformation. Within it, I will address the once-only principle, which is basically the ESPD, you would say, is the first building block of the once-only principle in public procurement. I'll come to that. And then looking at the digital transformation, about how new technologies may have a very big impact on public procurement in the near future. So key objectives, why altogether do we invest so much our energy and our time in trying to have e-procurement, and also to even create a legal obligation in the directive for e-procurement? It's an issue of transparency. Certainly the digital way creates much more opportunity, much more accessibility of information and also of data. So there is a huge potential that would help to increase competition, to fight against corruption. We had a reference to the contract register. I'll come to that. It creates savings. Certainly there is a potential if IT is not simply if we not simply translate paper word into IT word, but behind that there is a re-engineering, reprocessing of our way of doing, then it really makes sense. And here this is a point where I certainly would disagree with what Pedro said. There is a lot. Although it is true that the directive itself, I would say, is quite old-fashioned in its conception, but this directive is a few years ago when they have started the first drafting of the directive. That was already a few years ago. Now, what happens in the ground is very different. And actually, the legal framework leaves a lot of space for different approaches. And when you have things like marketplaces, like e-catalogs, you cannot say that you are doing the way things were done in the past. There is a radical shift. There is already a radical transformation taking place today. And I'd like to address this point now about the legal framework. And should we now, because many a point you raise are actually correct, but is changing the legal framework the right answer? First, is it possible? We have adopted the directive in 2014. We are now entering an infringement procedure with some member states that have even transposed it. And we would already be thinking about reopening and creating a new directive. That doesn't make sense. It's not possible. And it's probably not the way to go, because there are other ways of making sure we have e-procurement. And the pace of transformation, of technological transformation, is so high that, and if you look at the cycle, the legal cycle, to get a directive approved and implemented, these two things simply do not match. So, although yes, we can say, great, let's mandate everything, let's have a very clear legal framework, it's simply not feasible for the IT world, and making very specific IT related procurement law today would, in my view, would be extremely counterproductive and would be taken over by event very fast. So, state of play. You see, the same. But this one is a bit adapted. You will have access to this one as well. It includes a few additions, but here there is certainly something I need to correct. E-invoicing directive is about public procurement. So it creates an obligation for contracting authorities to accept any invoice that would respect the standard. But it is the obligation is only in public procurement. Now, it is true that the intention is to use that as a leverage to broaden it, to make sure that, I mean, it was also the intention of the market of creating, if in a critical mass of transaction a certain standard is used, there is a big chance that this standard will emerge. So the strategy is there, but the legal obligation is on public procurement. That needs to be made clear. So apart from what Pedro mentioned, there are some additions here which refer to, in particular, to the e-forms. So e-forms are these new, I mean, it's a bit technical, but it's very important. It's how the tenders are published, and this is how you relate those forms that were used in the past in the paper world. Now you put them in electronic format, and how you make sure that you improve data quality thanks to that, and you enlarge the scope in terms of data, and you reduce the amount of error. You try to avoid that indeed you have a serious problem of legal compliance in the way in the way things are published today. Sometimes business rules in IT program can do much better than a law to make this a reality, because with the law we haven't managed so far for a number of reasons that we could discuss bilaterally. State of play, very diverse, and that's another point I want to make. The EU is not one single situation. We have extremely diverse situation, and whilst it is true that common sense would have said, okay, why didn't we do that? Didn't we do those common sense things a few years ago? But simply because there is such a huge difference between the reality in the member states that it's simply not possible. So today we have a number of we can say e-notification, e-access, publication of document, electronic access of document. This we can say it's achieved across the EU. Now the e-submission, meaning just the pre-award phase, we have a high take-up in a number of member states, a medium take-up in many, and then you still have a low take-up in a number of other member states that are likely to be late with the deadline of November 2018. Now, beyond that, there has been there are other dimensions of the e-procurement infrastructures on which there has been progress. On ESPD is still slow, for sure it is slow, and one of the is very much connected to the previous slides. I mean, if you don't have an electronic procurement system in place, then how are you going to use electronic ESPD? And that's why many use the service that has been provided for the Commission. It was provided for that, for this transition period, but it has a lot of limitation, and it doesn't have all the potential that the ESPD has to bring the once-only principle, to which I'll come later. So we also have e-auction. E-auction is certainly something which is also quite new in the way things are being done in public procurement. You have many member states, and particularly in Central Europe, that have introduced very innovative way of doing public procurement. You have the DPS, you have e-catalogs, e-signatures. So this is already not in an homogeneous way, but it's taking place in many member states. One interesting element is the business model. What is the business model that is followed? You've mentioned the interesting one of Paraguay, and here also another parenthesis. I don't think in Europe we are so arrogant about our systems. We know the limitations. We know that what is happening in Chile, in Paraguay, in Ukraine is certainly much more advanced. And if you look at the conference we organize, these guys are invited regularly because we want to learn from them. So I don't think it is fair to say that we think our systems are the best, because we know they are not. Now, we also have very good and very innovative systems in Europe. Portugal was 10 years ago. It may no longer be at the edge today, but Estonia, Finland, many are today also doing very interesting things, and the cross-border dimension pushes technologies in a certain direction in an interesting way in some of our member states. So business models are very different because countries are very different. You have very small countries where one national systems may just suffice. You have federal countries with multiple and highly autonomous regions where you have different systems that sometimes don't even talk to each other, replicating the same problem you have at EU level. I'm just, for instance, referring to Germany in this case, but there may be others. So you have central system, one system that provides all the services of e-procurement, or you have at the other end of the spectrum, you have the Portuguese system with private operators, a number of private operators, and then you have hybrid systems where you have actually a combination of both. You have the possibility for private operators to compete with the national systems. You have that in the Netherlands, for instance. We haven't taken a very strong position on that. The directive doesn't say anything. What we have done is invest a lot on exchanging and reflecting with those member states about pros and cons and how to address them. In the case of central system, one of the risk is that as in all monopoly, I mean, it has the risk of all the monopolies, including the fact that you are locking a system which may not be with time the most innovative. Now, with the more private operators, you have more possibility for innovation, but you may also have problem of access to the data. How do you get as a public authority access to all those data that are so crucial? Data is the oil of public procurement, as somebody was saying, and the oil of many other things, but certainly also in public procurement. So there is an issue, and also how is the interoperability between all those platforms, and also in terms of data. So these are also challenging elements that have to be looked at if you go for the other model. Accreditation of platforms is probably an interesting way to go, and some member states are going in this direction. E-procurement infrastructure. It's a bit of a complicated slide, but it certainly makes the situation much more complex than what Pedro was saying. It's not just about ESPD, e-certis. There is a whole complex ecosystem in member states interacting between national level, EU level, and it's indeed complex. And governance is indeed a challenge. And many of the points you have raised are real issues, including on e-certis, that's for sure. But we have many operators. You see that there are something like 80 private service providers of procurement platform. You have standardization body, being the OCDS, being the SEN. You have a wide variety of systems. I will go a bit fast because I may not reach. This is the way the Commission has been trying to support this ecosystem. I'll come in a minute for more the policy side, but we have also financed and invested a lot of funds, including of the regional funds, have been used to develop, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, platforms. And now there is also a big support for the invoicing. Also, this slide shows all the ESPD systems, although many member states indeed are late or will be late, but also some are working hard, and many now are developing within their own solution an ESPD. So indeed, we have these two tools, e-certis and ESPD. I will look at them because they have been presented very well by Pedro, but I will come back to them on the once-only principle. Openness and partnership. This comes maybe to the more the policy and also the link with the communication. We have established a legal framework that has its strong point and its weak point. Is the result of a long process of negotiations. It's there. Now, we have to implement it. That is the challenge. There is unanimity that it is not the time already to revise it whilst we have not yet even starting implementing. So changing the legal framework is today not the option in the Commission. Now we'll see with the new commissioner in a bit more than a year, we'll have a different, but that will take ages anyway. So we have to have another working method. And this communication is about providing a vision about what are the things that for us we think are priorities, are important, what matters today in public procurement. And we have these 6 priorities. And we didn't want, although we have ideas on some of those aspects on how to push them forward, it is a partnership. Indeed, it's a partnership. So you don't decide all what you want to do alone and say it's a partnership and we are going to do this, this, and this, and this. No, we just provide a framework, a vision about, in our mind, these things matter today in public procurement. In the area of e-procurement, we have created a method of engagement, strong engagement with stakeholders. We have a forum, of the stakeholder forum on e-procurement, and we have a forum on invoicing. Some of you are part of it, very active members of it, where we have tried to create a community of practice with the member states, with a certain success in some areas, a real success, with its limitation as well. But it's more about engaging, about sharing, and about learning together. And I can tell you that in some instances, it can work as well as a legal framework, because people learn also. They don't necessarily like to be told what they have to do, but when they see how the neighbor is doing it, they may see, okay, why don't we try something like that? So this method, I don't say we don't need law, of course we do, but in the current context, this is where we want to invest our effort. And e-procurement is an example of it. So we do this stakeholder forum, we do this tour where we do workshop in each national member states, where we try to have everybody around the table and look at a number of critical aspects. It started with the ESPD, but it goes beyond it. We also want to use different tools, like as regards the contract register, for instance. We have no mandate I think our predecessors may have tried to put a contract register in place, but probably even the IT tools were not ready by then. But most probably the member states will not accept to put that, would not agree to a legislation creating an obligation for a contract register. But we have tried by already starting an award on contract register, saying what's the best one, just to show with the examples. And actually we have had, with this soft approach in the area of contract register, quite amazing success. Some member states, and they have even mentioned themselves that the idea came by discussing in the context of EXCEP with other member states, that they decided to create a contract register. So this group, EXCEP, has been very active in creating a number of reports that put the thoughts of the groups together, giving clear recommendation in terms of implementation. You will have in my presentation all the links to all those reports. I will not give them all to you now, but there is one on contract register, there is one on Murphy's Law, or what can go wrong in practice in an e-procurement system, how you address this problem, e-catalogs, certification of platforms. So together with the stakeholders, we've really created those recommendations looking at legal aspects, interpretation. Maybe interpretation is a big word that I shouldn't be using too quickly with lawyers in the room, but just looking at what is the legal framework and how some of the provision may be understood, and the leeway they leave or they don't leave. So you will have then access to all those reports. They're online. Everybody can have access to them. I was mentioning the governance report. We are doing this EU datathon also as stakeholders, private stakeholders can present projects about how to use data in public procurement, create application for that. These are all different ways of doing policy that we think also matter and have an impact. Now, data is certainly one of the key. It results from e-procurement. The cost of having data in the past, transaction cost was so high that it was not meaningful. Now today, with existing systems, it becomes possible to provide data at much lower cost. And we have done a lot. It started with the single market strategy, financing a big portal of open data called DigiWist. We are working on, which was done by a number of universities that you may be aware of. There is all the project on e-forms, the project on contract registers. So these were lines of activities related to data. And indeed, as Pedro was putting the communication, the recent communication, puts a priority on two aspects that are very much connected to e-procurement, the digitization in particular, transparency, and data. I don't know how much is left, but I'd like to come on the last point of digital transformation, having a look at the once-only principle. So the once-only principle is this idea that contracting authorities will not ask paper that have or proof or any document that they they already have received. But some call it even the not even once-only principle, that in the case that so many data are already in existing databases of the government in general, of public authorities in general, and whenever they are there, they shouldn't be asked for as any proof. The fact that you have paid your tax, you shouldn't be asked to do that if the systems, there are registers that can prove that very easily. And personally, I found it quite fascinating how the ESPD has been used very differently in different contexts. And for me, I mean, I think it's something would be, since I'm talking in a university, something that would certainly be interesting to look at in depth, is that you have, with the same legal framework, you have a complete different policy outcome. So the ESPD, indeed, in certain member states, I wouldn't say it's a nightmare, but it's certainly not an improvement. I will not give names, but certainly it's not a success. The ESPD in some other countries with the same rules has been used, and here I will quote them, this is certainly Finland, this is certainly Estonia. They have integrated, they have used the ESPD as an IT tool that is connecting all the existing registers that exist that are present in, for instance, in the case of Finland, where you have, I was talking about paying taxes and so on, where automatically this document goes and gets from the register with the authorization, of course, of the company, gets automatically in fields, if you want, automatically in less than a second, the ESPD. It's filled automatically. So it's a tremendous reduction of transaction cost. And you would ask, you can go and ask in Finland, people are really happy about the ESPD. You would go to another country, they would say, oh, what the EU is again doing. Same law, completely different outcome. So the importance of the ecosystem is crucial, And this is a very clear illustration, and E-certis is the same. Although I take the point, the point you have made are completely valid. They are real issue of legal certainty as regards E-certis, and I can tell you we are working on it, but it's not easy at all. But E-certis can also be used simply already as an IT tool that create those connections between different environments. And there, again, the ecosystem is crucial. You have pre-qualification systems that are, their job is to go and search for the information in the different databases, and they find this E-certis system very useful for them. Although the legal certainty should be better, should be certainly improved, they already find as an IT tool, it gives them a lot of potential and also reduce their transaction costs significantly. But this article, because the whole point of E-certis is to work as a support tool to make the once only principle a reality in the cross-border context, because this is of course crucial, that it's not only in national level like you have it in Finland, but that also it can be recognized automatically from one member state to the other. And there are some pilot work being done exactly between Estonia and Finland, for instance, to create this, how do you say that, mutual recognition of documents automatically, and therefore E-certis is really has a huge potential as an IT tool in this respect. This is the Finnish, so you'll have access to it in the slides. You have some examples of the slides. The last point, digital transformation. There is a tremendous development in the IT world, and certainly one more reason why it would become very difficult to legiferate today is that things are moving so fast. We even had a report from consultants who came and say that maybe 50, 60% of public procurement will disappear with artificial intelligence. Things will be done by machines. You won't need any procedures and so on. I don't know, we have not scratched to, but just this gives you the idea of how the magnitude of the change we may have ahead of us. And we see our responsibility as policymakers to be as much as possible in tune with those realities, but not jumping too quickly into conclusion, because we don't know yet where all those things like artificial intelligence, analytics, blockchain, Internet of Things, augmented reality. I mean, all those things we have asked a number of consultants to really look at those and try to identify how they will have an impact, how they could have an impact on public procurement. And we already see those things happening. Blockchain, we know it's used in a Belgian city of Antwerp. The artificial intelligence is also starting to be used for contracting and for forecasting the needs. So there are already a number of areas where digital transformation is taking place. So we see the key challenges, of course, to cope with those change. The big thing is interoperability, and there I certainly agree with you that avoiding creating islands is really even the core of the mandate of the Commission, and it's not easy. We cannot say we have succeeded so far, but we are working hard on it in this changing environment, and indeed standard is a way forward. OCDS is certainly a partner that we take very seriously, even if they have started somewhere else. It's coming from the World Bank, we don't care. We work very, very closely with the OCDS because precisely and they came at all our meeting on the contract register, they very often came to show what they can offer, but even though OCDS is not a complete standard yet, it's not, also it has to be interoperable with our own existing systems of TED and of the e-forms, but certainly this is an avenue where we think there is a lot of potential, especially because interoperability is interoperability in terms of transactions for everybody, but even or as important in terms of data, since data are going to become so important for governance, for competition policy, for even management, so in many areas it will be key, so we have to have interoperable data. Key challenge will also continue to be user-friendliness. If you look at the huge differences between systems today, and user-friendliness means transaction costs, there are big challenges there. You have the digital divide. We have, as I mentioned, huge differences in member states today on the level of digitization, and all the internal challenges, structural organizational behavior, that are also big issue to address, and which we are not necessarily well positioned as at the EU level, but yet are critical factor to be addressed. So this leads me naturally to make you an advert for the next conference. We do annual conferences, and we will have the next one that we do on e-procurement will exactly be, it will take place in Lisbon. It will take place on the day of the day of transposition of implementation of e-procurement, at least above EU threshold, 18th of November this year. And it will look precisely at what I was referring to about this digital transformation process. It will take stock of where we are, but it will also try to see in Europe and also away from Europe how these changes are occurring today and how they will radically transform our vision and our life as in the area of e-procurement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and it was extremely important that you stress the context. It's not the same in every country. There are so many differences, not only concerning the level of development, but legal issues and many other things. And also you informed us about those various measures that have to be taken in limited possibilities that you have on the level of European Union. Because on one side, you have, as you mentioned, this very fast information communication technology development. I was asking my colleagues, they're really experts in informatics, was there a decision that humans are not necessary anymore? Did they have heard that that decision was made? And they said, we didn't know about that. I said, me too. So, not only public procurement decisions, but generally speaking, you raise one very important issue, because one thing if something is tool, and one thing is something can develop independently, even from us. Who is going to switch off that artificial intelligence when the time comes? I don't know the person who will be so intelligent to switch off artificial intelligence. So now, all of us, not you, you deserved your dinner, we have to deserve dinner. The floor is yours.
Thank you, both of you. I had intention to sleep a little bit after after a lunch because I thought I know everything about e-procurement, but couldn't. I couldn't. Yeah. Mainly because you were talking, both of you, generally about e-procurement, and none of you mentioned e-appeal or remedy as a part of a procurement. So, remedy system is part of public procurement. So if we are talking about e-procurement, we should talk about e-remedy systems. And if we are talking about that we have a lot of problems in e-procurement, not mentioning remedy systems, then I should inform you, because I'm coming from remedy part, that we have much more problems in remedy system because due to in institutional autonomy, European Union's 27 member states looks like a jaguar skin, you know. Everything is different. So maybe we should talk about a remedy system when we are talking about e-procurement. I'm luckily coming from Croatia, where we have complete that procurement part which you mentioned, e-notification, e-submission, e-assessment, e-publication of the award of the contract, and we have e-possibility of submission of e-appeal. And we in the Commission have a digital application, and within maybe a couple of months we will have paperless e-appeal procedure. The result of a digital digital appeal procedure or remedy system is that you have register of the cases, which is online and accessible to everybody, and then you have all case law also visible and online, so remedy system is predictable. But okay, I said a couple of words of remedy system. You said a single market strategy, and I will not comment it, but talking about ASPD, let's say that we have directive which said something about ESPD, and then we have regulation which put forcibly ESPD in all member states as an obligatory part of the legal system. And then we have the third part, which is national legislation. And each and every member state tried to solve the problem with ESPD on a different way. Somebody, like in my country, that was just translated and put into the law, like our lawmaker acts like commission, addressing the idea to somebody else who should solve the problem. But that's what some other member states did. So we have also a huge diversity in ESPD, in national system, and it is very questionable how to use it. Since I'm coming from remedy part, we don't have possibility not to solve that problem, because when you have a complaint, you have to solve it somehow, to say something. Nevertheless, is it correct? Time should show that you were okay or not, but you have to solve the problem. So the problem exists. I'm addressing this to Commission. Problem exists. Different version of solution exists in different member states, and that is the state of play we have so far. And that's all. If Neymar didn't get any.
On your first point, I cannot agree more. It's yes, yes, yes. There is a short mention, but not as large as the one you make, and you're totally right that remedies in the ecosystem is a crucial element in public procurement. So, and there is also potential to make it easier through digitalization, and some member states have already been advancing on that. And indeed, this is even something we could look a bit deeper ourselves on, exchanging good practices and so on in terms of digitization of remedies. We've been focused on the pre-award for the reason of the legal obligation, but this is certainly an area where we can and should and will do more. On the ESPD, we have indeed, on the one hand, we want to leave a wide margin of maneuver in member states to adapt the ESPD to their own systems. So that is for user friendliness, precisely also to have the interaction with the existing register and so on, that all systems was not able to provide. Now, the big advantage of the system we had was exactly that it was possible in an, it was total interoperability because it was one system across. So it has, of course, a strong value. Our strategy is more to go towards standardization. So now we have a standard, which is not only a paper standard, a semantic one, but is a data standard as well, a data model. And we will make sure, and together with the member states, that we create this interoperability, that ESPDs can talk to each other, that a company coming from a neighboring country can use its own ESPDs and talk to the system in another member states. We are providing funding for that. I think Croatia was a country that has received funding for this kind of operation, of really creating a local ESPD, but an ESPD that is interoperable. That is the approach that we find, because it's the, in our view, the right balance between flexibility and interoperability. But it's, of course, that cannot be done, you know, interoperability also in the private sector, in IT, is a big issue. So it's work in progress, but I think it's progressing well.
So if I may add a couple of points to your answer, Nikita. I knew that Croatia was one of the countries that did that. I forgot to mention that Paraguay does it as well with the current system that they have, which is it allows for the remedy system to be processed inside the procurement platform or the procurement database and systems that are associated with it. That depends on a lot on member state to member state. Depends on how the systems, the remedy systems are set up within the context of the legal framework. In some cases, you're going to have countries that have appeals boards or appeals tribunals, which would be amenable to that. In other cases, they use the courts and they use the regular court system. So it really depends on that. Now, you've touched an interesting point, which is the remedies themselves. So it's a shame that, although I can understand that the procurement directive, in one hand, is old but not old enough to be reviewed. So my presentation was more for thought-provoking exercise than anything else. The remedies directive, the original one, is from '89, and the revision is from 2007. And it's a commission who recently, about a year ago or a year and a half ago, did the refit analysis of the directive and reached the conclusion that it was perfectly fine. So your question has to go to the Commission why it decided that the remedies directive was perfectly fine, when many of us legal scholars and lawyers think that it would benefit from an actual change. As for the SPD, I mean, I didn't want to come across as too negative about it, because what I think the SPD does is that it shows where the fault lines in the system are. So the fault lines were already there, but we didn't know they were there. And the SPD, because it's supposed to communicate with different systems in different countries, is just showing those faults. So where it's true that Finland internally is working very well with the SPD, and it's able to change its practice around it so that takes more benefit out of it. It's true as well that Finnish contracting authorities, including the central purchasing body, find it incredibly difficult to get data from other countries. So they're finding the use of the SPD when it means interfacing with other countries particularly challenging. So to the point that procurement procedures that would run within a certain timescale now are not possible because they're waiting for the contracting, or they're waiting for the public administrations in other countries to come back and confirm whatever data needs to be confirmed.
Thank you. So it seems that there are some minimum requirements that has to be, or minimum standards that are necessary. Of course, there are different countries with different contexts, But to introduce something, like, you know, in every room you have 220 volt. That is something that is minimum requirement. And to provide realization of certain purpose, you need it. Everything which is above that could be, of course, helpful. Professor, sorry, please.
Do you want to go first? I think you would.
Yes, I think I do, because I would like also to hear the answer of Angela.
Okay.
I would like Angela to listen to my expectations, and so she can also respond. She's a key actor. May I have a microphone? Sorry, Angela, but it's polite, actually. Okay, I apologize in advance if my little fable is going to be very imprecise, unprovable, purely speculative, but it's your fault. And I feel very, very uncomfortable after this session. And so I want to say why I am uncomfortable after this session. It starts with Pedro. Technical, legal, procedural issues not explained. Why there are delays. To me, that smells purely of politics. Politics invents technical, legal, procedural issues for something that is larger, but that's... Then Nikita said something very interesting. He spoke about a word. I immediately went on Wikipedia. He spoke twice or three times about a word that I like a lot, which is called ecosystems. If you go on Wikipedia, which I did 2 minutes ago, it says an ecosystem is a community of living, so persons, and non-living, so technology, organisms. And I started thinking if Europe is an ecosystem, and the first thing that came to my mind when I thought of Europe is the slide of Pedro of the islands of the Canaries that are growing more distant and more apart. And I don't think we can talk about e-procurement without talking about what is happening in Europe right now. And so, instead of talking about Paraguay, I would like to talk about a model that we've always had in Europe, which is clearly in our head, which is United States of America, which is what we want to do, what we want to achieve, United States of Europe. Now, if I look at I was talking with Enzo now, if we look at the system of United States, there's really something amazing. The e-procurement system in America, correct me if I'm wrong, is very fragmented. It's totally non-integrated, with the exception of the federal government. And they absolutely, if you go to the States, you can stay there for 2 years, you will never see this emphasis on a debate on e-proc national politics. They don't worry about interoperability, they don't give a damn. They don't give a damn. So why in the, yes, okay, so you can tell me more about that. Why the EU is so different from the United States system? Why do we have in the EU this desire from a push from the top of e-procurement integration? And I'm sorry with Pedro, I cannot believe that all this push from the top is for the nice idea of direct cross-border for SMEs. I will never buy it, especially for the reasons you said, language, for one. Okay? So I'm going to put out a theory of why the EU wants so badly this system from the top of e-procurement. And this is where Angela comes in too.
Can you specify, because do we want a system from
Yes,
the
you
top?
want it badly. The European Commission wants it badly. I think
How? Can you specify? Be specific?
Because you make so many meetings about e-procurement, which they don't do in the States. It's there. The answer is there. Okay, but Angela's going to say something. But let me almost come to my conclusion. I think that the reason why you want so badly procurement is because e-procurement helps you in achieving another goal that you want so badly, because it makes it easier, which is centralization. And e-procurement certainly, the centralization, I'm talking about centralization of tenders, okay? E-procurement makes centralization more likely for sure. So much so that look at United States. United States hates centralization. It almost bans it because it needs to protect the small firm. And so there's no emphasis about this thing of procurement, e-procurement in the United States. What is centralization? Centralization is a huge power struggle. It takes away powers from certain people and it gives it to others. These people, I would call them sovereign. And these people who are sovereign, who are seeing by centralization their power taken away, have two ways of resisting. They don't provide data, they don't provide interoperability. They resist. What you have said about Europe, Italy knows very well. We've had a problem of interoperability among cities, among regions. They don't want to give up on their power of procurement. So, to finish this long discussion, which is 90% wrong, I make a prediction, which has to do also with Europe. I make a prediction that in a world where centralization is not pursued, it is not made a goal, a little bit like in the United States, we're going to see all of a sudden more joint procurement, more joint e-procurement, more common technology, because after all, there is an advantage of technology. It helps us to save costs. It has efficiency gains. It has informational advantages. A little bit like the Korean system, where you have a big innovative e-procurement, but where everybody is free to do its own procurement. Once you remove the connection between these two things, all of a sudden, I believe that you're going to see the push towards technology much faster and less politicized. But I wanted to hear what you thought about this.
Question, I'm Angela from the Italian CPB, so the Italian centralized system. Well, Gustavo, I partly agree with you, but personally have a different opinion on the Korean and on the American systems. The Korean is a rather mandatory regime. You are obliged to use the CONEPs, and especially for certain thresholds. And the great advantage of Korea is that it is 100% digitalized already, so e-procurement is not an issue because data are already online.
But it's not aggregated.
It's not aggregated, but since it is mandatory to use a unique platform, the data is there, the majority of the data is there. In the US, I agree with you. They don't even participate to our e-procurement meetings. They just snob us because they don't care about e-procurement. They just run their multiple award schemes. There are hundreds of thousands of American potential suppliers to be chosen autonomously by contracting authorities, and that's it. They aggregate the qualification stuff that you can buy from whoever you want to during your multiple award scheme. But coming back to Pedro and Nikita, I met Pedro today. Either I didn't understand, or either you are wrong. First point, let's say I didn't understand.
Sorry?
Let's take into consideration that I didn't understand. You said that the European ESPD model is phasing out, and you were wondering of what was going to happen to those countries who still haven't developed their national. It hasn't phased out. Nikita, am I allowed to say that somebody else is taking over, or is it a secret?
No, it's not a secret. Well, you can, no, you can see, there is no secret. You go ahead, I will adjust if
there was an ongoing process of applications for those who was going to take over, and TED is taking it over. It's not disappearing it. There will be no discontinuity in the system, if I got right your wondering, your concern. There's no concern on that, because those countries who will not develop their electronic models, and Italy is one of them, who is a bit late, but our colleagues here are working on it from Majid, they can still use the European one, which will be just taken over by another institution, but will not disappear. This was my first potential misunderstanding. The second one is on the e-Certis. So Nikita, either you change the disclaimer on the e-Certis page, or Pedro is right. But the point is that Italy is taking very seriously the updating of these Certis.
Yes.
There is a team of people working. There is an office devoted to that. So I would never say it is unreliable. I would never think about an unreliable Italian e-Certis update on this. So I think, Nikita, you should change that disclaimer as soon as possible.
Okay.
It's leading to misunderstandings, and it's allowing Pedro to criticize you. I'm giving you a hand. Another misunderstanding. In the section of your presentation where you were talking about what we are doing, there's a sentence saying contract registers are mandatory. Is that a wishful thinking, or is it the state of the art? They're not mandatory. I had the pleasure to be part of the European Commission working group of the EXEP, trying to outline the European Commission recommendation on contract registers. Believe me, there is a high level of resistance. There was a high level of resistance on disclaiming data from the e-procurement players of Europe that you can't even imagine. So is a mandatory new European directive on e-procurement, let's say we can manage to make it in the next couple of years, is that going to solve the problem? Everybody would be against it. There is still we are in the area of digitalization, in the digital area, 2.0, 3.0, but there's a resistance in the use of data, open data, standards, and electronic procedures that is unexplainable. And the more I participate in the meetings of the European Commission, the more I am aware that there is really a cultural problem rather than a lack of interoperability. We still have a priority problem, which is mindset in the mind of the people. The people. I think it's really cultural, Gustavo, and they are the ones representing their country in the e-procurement working group. The European Commission, okay, they can do better, and I totally agree with you with the position that the Commission took on the remedy, on the assessment of the effectiveness of the remedy directive. I'm sorry, Nikita, I have to say it. I totally disagree, and we as a CPB, a network of European CPBs, have presented a very interesting paper to the European Commission where we are suggesting where and how to improve the directive. And let's hope that maybe we have opened their mind on how to assess this directive. But on the other hand, they are doing a lot of things in order to help us move to e-procurement. The transition period has been supported by working groups, hundreds of meetings in the country, meetings in Brussels, financed by them. Every time I go to the EXEP, they pay for my travel and my accommodation. So this is money invested by the Commission in helping member states make this transition possible. So they are investing time, people, and money. And now they are also investing money to train the newborn CPBs around the world, around Europe. There are newborn CPBs in Europe. We need funds to train them. And
for SMEs, huh? It's
Yes, but this is the problem. SMEs do not need help from central purchasing bodies. They don't need central purchasing bodies.
no, it's a different aspect of funding. They fund SMEs and they fund CPBs on a different level.
I know.
Yeah.
Not fancy.
But at least let's try to put the skills in the newborn CPBs. Otherwise, what a big mistake. And Gustavo, I have to say that when Nikita talks about wiki, it's not Wikipedia. It's the European Commission wiki. Okay. So I'm looking forward to your Pedro's answers. Thank you.
Okay.
What's wrong?
So I'm not touching you anymore. So, Nikita, could you go back to your slides where you had a mention in red at the bottom saying that the system would be, the SPD system would be switched off or turned off in April 2019?
No, I think I should be answering this question.
Okay, if you want to answer that bit.
Because indeed there is a mistake, not in you,
Okay.
but, and I mean, what will be switched off is the service that we today provide. This will no longer exist. So today we have a service, it's a web service where you can fill your ESPD. This one will be interrupted in 2019. What will be transferred to the OP is a data model that member states can use to integrate in their own platform. So it may well be indeed that some member states will not be ready in 2019, but we gave them a lot of time precisely to get ready. This implementing regulation is now quite old already, 2016, January, the ESPD implementing regulation. We give them until 2019 to make their own system. So, I mean, nobody is completely wrong or right, but our system as a web service will be dismantled, and there will be only left a data model that member states can integrate in their systems, and that will be maintained by the Commission and the stakeholders. It's a standard, if you want. It's a standard.
So my comment was correct. I only referred to the service and not to any other of the other elements. I didn't refer to the underlying data exchange model. I didn't refer to any of the documentation. I referred exclusively to that service. So apparently I was correct. I didn't know that the responsibility for the maintaining the data model or the standard would be moved on. That I didn't know. As for your second question, in terms of e-certificates in Italy, I'm glad that Italy is taking it so well and so seriously, because other member states are not. I mean, there's plenty of students here from Belgrade who I had the pleasure of teaching 2 weeks ago, and we ran some exercises with e-certificates itself, and I can't remember which country we're trying to use, but there was basically nothing in there. So the fact that Italy is taking it seriously doesn't mean that the other member states are. Regarding contract registers, I was not saying that we're going to have contract registers. That is what is on the document of the Commission. That's what's on the Commission strategy, that they want to have mandatory contract registers.
No.
It's not me saying it. The Commission strategy from 2017.
No.
No?
It doesn't say mandatory.
No?
It doesn't say mandatory.
Okay.
Our line has never been it should be mandatory. We believe contract registers are a good thing because they enhance transparency and they should be in open source, open data as much as possible. That's our philosophy. But we never say that it should be mandatory. We know we have no mandate for that, and it may not even be a good idea to mandate to those that do not want to have it.
So I stand corrected on that bit. So I read mandatory somewhere else, and I assumed it referred to that. But at least there is the idea of having contract registers, which I stand by the bulk of my criticism, which is they make sense. They do not make sense in a world, or they should not be used in a world where we're still using a publication system. We should instead move to a transactional system. And then your final comment. I mean, I have half an hour to comment, and so I prefer to pick on the pain points and analyze them than praising the Commission for what it's doing well. So if it's working and giving a lot of support, I mean, credit where it's due. I don't have a problem with that. But I only have 30 minutes, so I decided to allocate my 30 minutes to where I thought would be most useful.
No, it could have been good to give 5 minutes to the good thing we do.
I just gave you 2 minutes.
Okay, many things. We have clarified the point on E-certificates. Yes, great that Italy is doing it, but it's true that not all member states are doing that, and it's very difficult to enforce. We can hardly convince our legal service to go to Luxembourg to the court on just simply because they don't have populated fully all the criteria. So indeed we have a problem here of legal enforcement. It doesn't mean that, I mean, there has been huge progress. If you look at how the situation has evolved, also because the legal basis of the new directive is much stronger. So there has been huge progress, but we are not yet there, and that is fully acknowledged. No, so then coming back to your, is it conspiracy theory? I think these are two debates. There is centralization debate, which I'm very happy to take again with you, because we may have agreement and a zone of disagreement, but I don't think it is fair to join the two, because that's not true. This is not the intention of e-procurement, of having a system pushing e-procurement to push centralization. It will not be even a good strategy, because I think e-procurement has also an extremely powerful decentralization mechanism inbuilt. In many instances now you can, I mean, for instance, I give just an example, centralizing purchase of traveling arrangement doesn't make any sense. Now people do that themselves directly. Thanks to digitization, you go to booking.com, you do it, it's cheaper, faster to do it yourself. So e-procurement has a very strong decentralization dynamic in itself. So it would be even a wrong theory, but even if we were wrong, and that's not why we do it. That's not why. Even though centralization we think has in some instances a disadvantage, and actually that e-procurement can mitigate some of the risk of centralization, but we don't do it for that. Now, I take the point that saying that we do it for the 3% of cross-border procurement, that's not all of it, of course. It would be stupid for us to push so much resources just for that. The business model, I mean, that's my personal point of view, but I don't think the business model of public procurement is a cross-border business model. It's only in some instances it makes sense, otherwise it happens through establishment of subsidiary company if there is some cross-border. But it doesn't mean that there is no added value to do things at the European level, and I think the work we do in EXCEP is a demonstration of that through this learning process, I mean, being in a union is also learning from each other. There is a huge advantage of learning from each other. You know it from the university, you have international students everywhere. This dynamic of learning from each other, we think that is in our mandate, and that's why we think we have to invest so much. We do these meetings and all those things is for a learning process and not for creating, I don't know, some kind of centralization, Aldous Huxley kind of system, no.
Can I just go back to Angela? Sorry, Angela. Tomorrow is a new day. I know. On page 11 of the Commission's communication, there's this sentence: to this end, setting up publicly accessible contract registers is strongly recommended. So, in my mind, what this led to was not that the Commission was mandating the creation of contract registers, but that it was recommending the creation of contract registers that would then be mandatory. So there was a mixture there in terms of what I originally meant and what I might have said and might have led to your misunderstanding.
No, it is very important that we don't use that word, because we have always said we are not going to mandate, we are not going to create any legal instrument to mandate it. And that was based on this trust relation we want, because this partnership has to be based on trust. We believe it's a good idea. Contract register, so we strongly recommend it, but we will never impose it. That was the point.
But that is the point that I'm referring to. What I was specifically referring to is that for contract registers to work, they need to be mandatory at the national level at least. So otherwise, if they're not mandatory in that end, I wasn't, when I was designing the presentation, I wasn't considering that the Commission would force the creation of mandatory contract registers, but that the contract registers that might be created, for them to be useful, they need to be mandatory.
Yes.
Because otherwise, no one's going to comply with them.
Of course.
Gustavo mentioned predictions. And after your presentation, I said this is going to be the most interesting session. That's one. Second, in Serbia, very often they are trying to use words centralization and decentralization. And immediately there is a fight. So what I'm using is the word standardization, which can provide space for centralization and decentralization, depending on our needs. So, and that is the way how I succeeded in strategy of public administration reform. It's obvious that this villa is inspiring all of us. And I made mistake when I said you deserved lunch and the others should try to get it. And I think that we can finish this session. Thank you very much. Thank you.